Well, so far we've looked at Old Testament eschatological expectations and the significance of Christ's first coming. And in the last lecture, we looked at the overall eschatological structure of the Bible and the significance of Christ's second coming. And I think what we looked at last time is of most importance, because if you understand the overall structure and the significance of Christ's second coming, then everything falls into place, I think, relatively easily. In this lecture, I want to take a look at a historical overview of eschatological thought. And I think this is important because scholars and Christians from the first century on have written about eschatology. And as one person wrote, he says that an interpretation that is quite apart from generally accepted and historical interpretations is not necessarily wrong, but it is at least suspect. It might be said that the burden of proof falls on the innovator. Now, let's take a look, beginning with what are called the Apostolic Fathers. The Apostolic Fathers refers to writings of the late 1st century and the early 2nd century. They include such things as the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, Clement of Rome, Ignatius, and Papias, and a number of others. And then there were the post-apostolic fathers. They are the writers who discussed Christian doctrine basically in the 3rd century through the 5th century, including such people as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius, Athanasius, and Augustine. Now, what we see when we look at these apostolic and post-apostolic fathers is that the seeds of proto-amillennialism and proto-historic premillennialism were sown early on. Now, some writers have said that premillennialism, in other words, the idea that Jesus will come and then there will be a temporary 1,000-year millennium before he sets up the eternal kingdom. Some writers say that some form of premillennialism was the dominant view of the early church. That really is not correct. In fact, as one writer points out, a guy by the name of Alan Patrick Boyd, he did a survey of eschatological writings in the apostolic and post-apostolic period from until the death of Justin Martyr in AD 165. And he said, this demonstrates that perhaps seminal amillennialism ought to be seen as the dominant eschatology of the period. Now, that conclusion, I think, is credible because Boyd himself is a dispensational premillennialist who undertook his study to try and bolster the system he had been taught, namely dispensationalism, but he concluded that the evidence of the original sources simply disallowed this. Now, so we have views that nowadays would be termed historic premillennialism and amillennialism being found in the early Christian writings. One of the things I've done in the book is look at the main things that most of the early apostolic and post-apostolic fathers were writing about eschatology, and I found 8 main themes in their writings. The first is that the last days were present at the time, and they would unfold with the occurrence of various events which would bring about Christ's second coming in the relatively near future. So the apostolic and post-apostolic fathers tended to think that Christ's second coming would be in the relatively near future, not necessarily in their own day, but most of them did not seem to envision that 2,000 years would go by and still he would not have come again. And secondly, although the church was in the last days and the events of history were eschatologically relevant, the second coming would not be immediate, but the Roman Empire would be broken, an antichrist character would arise, and the church would have to pass through tribulation, which would serve to purify it. So while they were expecting the second coming to come in the relatively near future, they realized that it would not be immediate, that these events would have to take place. That's important because it shows as you may recall, we've talked about the idea of dispensational premillennialism. In other words, pre-tribulationism, the idea that Christ is going to rapture his church away so that they will avoid tribulation. That was never the view of the early writers. They viewed the fact that the church would have to pass through tribulation, which would serve to purify it. So this idea of dispensationalism, this pre-tribulational rapture that would spare one generation from suffering, well, I think it's a completely heretical idea, but no one ever dreamed that up. That, as we will see later in this lecture, that whole idea wasn't even invented until 1830. So, thirdly, the second coming would be visible. Fourth, the second coming would entail the resurrection of the dead and the rapture of the living saints. I mean, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, it points out that there is the rapture, but it is not the pre-tribulational rapture that dispensationalists talk about. In 1 Corinthians 15, it says that the dead in Christ will rise first, but then we will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. And that change of living believers when Christ comes again is known as the rapture. And fifth, the second coming, again, I'm talking about the beliefs of the apostolic and post-apostolic fathers, would bring with it the judgment of believers and unbelievers alike. So we talked actually about this in the last lecture, that the second coming will be visible. The second coming involves the resurrection of the dead and the rapture of living saints. The second coming brings with it the judgment of believers and unbelievers alike. And the early church writers also concluded that the second coming will bring about the destruction or renewing and transformation of the earth. And so in the last lecture, we talked about that, the second coming of Christ involves three things, or there are three entailments of that: resurrection of everybody, judgment of everybody, and the renewal of the earth. Then the early writers, another theme of the eschatological writings of the early writers was that the second coming ushers in the kingdom of God, which is a time of worldwide rule of Christ and the rest, rule, and holiness of believers on the earth. And finally, the early writers were quite clear that the promises given to the Old Testament Israel are not to be taken literally as applying to the physical nation of Israel, but are applied to the church, which has taken the place of Israel. And again, that is something that is contrary to the view of dispensationalists, who draw this sharp distinction between Israel and the church and say that promises given to Old Testament Israel have to be literally fulfilled in the physical nation of Israel. I should point out that what the apostolic and post-apostolic fathers were saying, that the promises given to Old Testament Israel are actually applied to and fulfilled in the church, is a theme we see throughout the Bible. We talk a lot about that in our book on biblical theology, and have an entire section on how prophecies that on their face were related to Old Testament Israel, in fact, find their fulfillment in Christ and the church. Now, as I mentioned, one of the things that Boyd found was that none of the distinctive beliefs of dispensational premillennialism were present in the apostolic and post-apostolic era at all. And so while there were the seeds of early historic premillennialism, dispensational premillennialism is something that only was invented in 1830. And so another writer by the name of William Everett Bell, he summarizes the data from the apostolic and post-apostolic fathers with these five conclusions. He says, every writer who deals with the subject of eschatology in any specific way is post-tribulational. And again, what that means is that the church will go through tribulation. Christ will come after the tribulation, not before it. Secondly, no writer sees a dual coming of Christ. In other words, again, the so-called dual coming of Christ is a uniquely dispensational idea that Christ will come first, sort of halfway to the earth, and take his saints, the believers, back with him to heaven, and then, after 7 years, he will come back fully to the earth. That view, as I say, was only invented in 1830. No writer until then, for the first 1800 years of church history, believed that. And thirdly, no writer expresses an expectation of physical removal from the earth before the tribulation. Rather, the general eschatological theme involves exhortations to stand steadfast in the present or coming distress. Fourth, no writer expresses astonishment or dismay as being in the tribulation period, although this reaction would be almost certain if some had expected a prior rapture. But they all realized, Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulation. And they took that seriously because it's always been true. The idea that one particular generation, just before Jesus comes again, is going to be spared tribulation is found nowhere in the Bible. And then fifth, Bell points out, no writer distinguishes between Israel and the church in the dispensational manner. Another writer points out that the so-called pre-tribulational rapture was an idea not held by any church father or students of the word before the 19th century. So those are the basic views of the apostolic and post-apostolic fathers, essentially up through the 6th century AD. Now, after that period of time, the amillennial eschatology, in other words, that the so-called millennium, the 1,000 years, is a symbolic period of time, essentially from the time of Christ's first coming until shortly before his second coming, that he will come once and bring with it resurrection of the just and unjust alike, judgment of just and unjust alike. There will not be a temporary 1,000-year reign, but when he comes, he will then inaugurate the eternal state. That was the dominant view from the time of the post-apostolic fathers up until the time of the Reformation in the 1500s. Now, there were still premillennialists at that time, particularly among some mystical sects, and some reform-minded orders within the Roman Catholic Church. There was the beginning of some post-millennial eschatology. And again, post-millennialism refers to the idea that the millennium, the so-called millennium, will be a discrete period of time in history before Jesus comes again as a result of growing Christian influence. So the dominant view was the amillennial view, but these other views, premillennial and postmillennial views, were present in a smaller fashion. Now, amillennialism has continued to be the dominant eschatological position throughout Christianity as a whole since the Reformation. But the Reformation unleashed new ideas that gave rise to other eschatological views. For example, during the Reformation, beginning in the 15 and 1600s, particularly the Lutherans and Reformed groups, in other words, those who followed Luther and John Calvin, generally followed Augustine with respect to eschatology. Now, the radical reformers, the Anabaptists, emphasized the expectation of Christ's earthly reign, but the Reformation set in motion certain events that affected eschatological views long after the Reformation itself was over. Now, Luther's eschatology, he is the one who first identified the papacy, the pope, either an individual pope or the papacy as an institution, as the antichrist. And this became a standard part of Protestant eschatology for about 200 years or so. And one of the reasons Luther did this was that the Pope's chief theologian, Sylvester Prierius, had written that the Pope cannot lawfully be deposed or judged either by a church council or by the whole world, even if he is so scandalous as to lead people with him by crowds into the possession of hell. Well, Luther responded, "Be astonished, O heaven! Shudder, O earth! Behold, O Christians, what Rome is! It must therefore have been the chief devil himself who said what is written in canon Roman Catholic law, that if the Pope were so scandalously bad as to lead crowds of souls to the devil, he still could not be deposed." Now, the Roman Catholic Church responded to Luther and tried to refute Luther's identification of the papacy with Antichrist. And they did this primarily in two ways. One man, Francis Ribera, who lived in the mid to late 1500s, reintroduced the medieval view of Antichrist as a future event. In other words, somebody who would conclude history. Other Catholic apologists took the opposite approach and kind of looked at the church and eschatology as involving essentially a war of the church, first with the Jewish synagogue and then with paganism in the early centuries. In other words, sort of a preterist view where things, in other words, the Antichrist, this was something that happened back maybe before AD 70 or before the end of the Roman Empire. So futurism looking to Antichrist and the second coming as future, or preterism. Now, following this, there was the rise and then decline of post-millennialism. Post-millennialism tended to develop in the 17th century by certain Lutheran and Reformed theologians. And so this became the main view of the Puritans in the 1700s through the 1900s. They were responding to Roman Catholicism's futurism that had been promulgated by this guy Ribera, and that led the English Puritans to reject futurism, and so their dominant view is post-millennialism, and they were confident in the progress of people and of the church through technology and things like that, and science, and so that they saw the future discrete millennium, a discrete period of time, not the symbolic time that the amillennials are talking about, but they saw it as developing as Christianity spreads over the earth, as science and technology improve life. Well, postmillennialism's influence waned considerably, particularly after World War I and World War II, and all the other tragedies in the 20th century show, even in supposedly Christian countries, showed that in many respects the world is not getting better and better. Although in recent years, postmillennialism, particularly connected with partial preterism, has shown a revival. Now, I mentioned the dispensational premillennialism, the view that Israel and the church are distinct, that prophecy has to be interpreted literally, that promises given to Old Testament Israel are now going to be fulfilled in the new physical nation of Israel, that there will be a pre-tribulational rapture where Christ takes the church bodily out of the world, and so they're spared tribulation. The tribulation primarily relates to Israel, and then Christ will come back and set up a 1,000-year reign from a literal throne in Jerusalem, but then there will be a great rebellion, and Christ will then set up the eternal state. That view began in the 1830s. It basically traces its origin to kind of a sect group in England called the Plymouth Brethren, so that group grew rapidly in popularity, especially among American fundamentalists, and it is particularly popular still today. It was popularized by the so-called the Scofield Bible, and it's very popular in conservative churches, independent fundamentalist churches, and Pentecostal churches. And the birth of Israel in 1948 gave it a wide hearing. But beginning in the 1980s, even dispensationalists have recognized that various aspects of their theology are biblically indefensible, and that gave rise to what is now called progressive dispensationalism. Part of the reason for the decline of dispensationalist premillennialism may lie in the fact that dispensationalists were known, throughout their history of looking to events in the Middle East, looking to events in the world, and trying to say, see, this was predicted by the Bible. And so, they looked to the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, the Soviet Union after World War II, the founding of modern Israel in 1948, the rise of the European Common Market and the European Community, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the rise of radical Islam, all these political and economic actors and events, and every single one of them was supposedly the fulfillment of some prophecy. Very interestingly, though, when one thing would pass away, I remember listening to one particular dispensationalist who was talking about when the Soviet Union still existed and Germany was divided between West Germany and East Germany. He said, see, it's just exactly what the Bible predicted. And the East Germans were the sons of Dharma, and the West Germans were something else. Well, then the Soviet Union collapses. Germany is reunited. And do we ever hear an apology? Do we ever hear, I was wrong? No. But then I heard that same speaker say, some years later, Islam, it's just exactly what the Bible has predicted. What about wasn't that just exactly what the Bible predicted? And that has been characteristic of these things. It's sort of sensationalism. And as one writer pointed out, when Hal Lindsey, who was a big dispensationalist, premillennialist, claimed that the 1980s were the terminal decade of human history, and that all these things must come to pass within a generation of the founding of the State of Israel in 1988. He was placing dispensational premillennialism's credibility on the line. And of course, it didn't happen. But you've got to recognize one can only make these false assertions so often. It's like the story of the little boy who cried wolf. You may know it. Little boy guarding the sheep, and he wanted to have fun, and so he said, "Wolf, wolf!" And so the townsmen come out, and he laughs and said, "No, there was no wolf." So they go back. He cries again, "Wolf, wolf!" They come out. No, there's no wolf. He cries, but then he sees a real wolf and cries, "Wolf, wolf!" But the townspeople don't believe him, and he gets eaten. You can only cry wolf so often before people will stop believing you. And I think that has been a huge problem with dispensational premillennialism, because its whole view of eschatology, there are certain commonalities between it and historic premillennialism, but is actually based on an entirely different basis, as we will talk about in subsequent lectures. So, what's the contemporary situation? The amillennial position has always been, I think, the dominant position of eschatology throughout the church and the world. It continues to be the major eschatological position among Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists, Roman Catholics, and the Eastern Orthodox since the post-Reformation era. Premillennialism, divided into both its dispensational and historic varieties, remains the dominant eschatological view among Baptists, Pentecostals, and other evangelicals, although there seems to be a movement among evangelicals who are looking much more favorably on amillennialism than they did in the past. Post-millennialism is held primarily by some groups within the Reformed camp. And when I say Reformed, I'm talking about primarily Presbyterians. Full preterism. Remember, the idea that all of biblical prophecy was fulfilled, including the second coming and so on, at the time of the fall of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. That received its first systematic expression by a book by a guy named J. Stuart Russell called The Parousia, first published in 1878. It's believed by a relatively small number, but partial preterism, the idea that the events of AD 70 were fulfilled a number of Old Testament prophecies, but were not the end-all and be-all, but that Jesus will be coming again. That has been systematized by a number of scholars and finds acceptance among a number of people who otherwise have amillennial or post-millennial views. So that's kind of a brief historical overview of how the church has viewed eschatology historically. And again, I think it's important that we know history rather than thinking that trying to reinvent the wheel, because these scholars for the last 2,000 years have written about this, and we dismiss what they say, I think, at our peril. We at least need to be aware of what the church has believed and deal with it if we differ from what the church has believed in the main. Now, beginning with the next and subsequent lectures, we will take a look in more detail at the primary eschatological views, the primary views of the millennium, and both their strengths and their weaknesses.